Life in ancient Babylon was not easy. If you were born a slave or a woman, your life was particularly tough. But if you managed to work your way up to become a member of the ruling class, then a new set of problems came along. The ancient Mesopotamian Empire of Babylon is often cited as one of the first great empires in history. These tablets show us that the Babylonian Empire was stratified into several different classes. Well, it just so happens that in your wedding week, the Babylonians experienced a lunar eclipse. According to Babylonian religion, the moon god Sin was having an affair with the goddess of twilight and caused her to become pregnant. You see, back in those days, parents didn't use diapers. Instead, they would wrap the umbilical cord around the baby's backside as a kind of makeshift diaper. Back in those days, the most common explanation for illness was that the four humors of the body had become unbalanced. Once you determined that, then you had to do whatever you could to appease them. If someone was killed by an animal, then it was a sign that the god who controlled that animal was angry at them. And remember to subscribe for more fun history. If someone was killed by fire, then it was the god of fire who had taken revenge. If someone died by drowning, then it was the god of the underworld who wanted them. Basically, death itself was viewed as a divine punishment. And every method of death carried its own message from the gods. That means that every day could be your last. And if it was, then you would need to be prepared to face the god who was taking your life and explain to him why you shouldn't be punished. Of course, this was easier said than done, because if you had done something bad in your life, you wouldn't even know where to begin. For example, if you had leprosy, then it was obvious that you had angered the gods of healing, Ishtar and Shamash. So you would pray to them and offer sacrifices to get on their good side again. But sometimes appeasing the gods just wasn't enough. Take the case of Nabopolassar's son, for example. Remember the story about the locusts? Well, it turns out that wasn't the only animal that this guy had problems with. After he became king, he went to the temple to sacrifice to Marduk and wash himself to prepare for the ceremony. While he was washing, a venomous snake bit him and killed him. Now, while this was obviously an accident, it didn't stop the priests from claiming that Marduk had taken revenge on him. See, Marduk was usually depicted holding a snake in his hand. And since the king had been bitten by a snake and killed, the priests believed that Marduk had reclaimed his power over the king and placed it back in his own hands. This theory originated in Greece around 400 BC, and it remained a dominant theory on medicine for over 1,000 years. According to this theory, humans are composed of four elements: earth, air, fire, and water. Each of these elements is associated with one of the four humors: phlegm, yellow, and black bile, and blood. And each of these humors is associated with one of the four seasons. The idea was that in order to stay healthy, the four humors needed to be balanced. If they were out of balance, then a person would become ill, and the imbalance had to be corrected. The most effective method of correcting the humors was through bloodletting, which was the process of draining blood from the body. While bloodletting can be an effective treatment for some conditions, it can also be extremely dangerous. In many cases, it actually ended up making people sicker. The Babylonians even invented special tools to make bloodletting easier, such as scarification tools and leeches. The problem was that, when it was time for the baby to have their first bowel movement, the poop would end up staining the umbilical cord. And depending on the color of the poop, it could either be a good thing or a very bad thing. If the umbilical cord turned green after being stained, it meant that the baby would grow up to be a prosperous merchant. However, if the cord turned black, then the child's fate was sealed. They were destined to become a slave. There was no hope for someone with a black umbilical cord. During this time, the sun god Shamash saw the two together and became enraged. If you were born with a crooked foot, then it was clear that you weren't favored by the gods. One of the most important duties of the king was to lead the army into battle. If the king was sickly or deformed in any way, then it could bring shame on his house. After all, how could he inspire his troops if he couldn't even walk right? So if a king was born with any physical ailment, he was often put to death. Sometimes the queen was ordered to give birth via a C-section, so that if the baby was unhealthy, they could kill the infant before anyone even knew that they were alive. But what about regular people in Babylon? If someone was born with a disability, then their parents would simply abandon them on the side of the road to die. It wasn't uncommon to see children with disabilities begging alongside the streets of Babylon. and if you gave one of these unfortunate children food, it was believed that your wish would be granted. But please don't take this advice. As far as we can tell, this never actually worked. He then punished the lovers by turning them into animals, which is why dogs are prohibited from mating during the night. Now, while this myth doesn't specifically say anything about eclipses, astronomers of the time made the connection between the mythological story and astronomical events, since it was believed that the moon was being chased around the sky by the sun. When the moon became dark, it was thought that the sun had finally caught her. Therefore, any eclipse was considered an ominous sign that the gods were angry. And in ancient Babylon, if the gods were angry, everyone else was soon very likely to become angry too. At the top of the social hierarchy were the elites, which included not only the royal family, but also the wealthy merchants, priests, and temple administrators who dominated the economy. The king was essentially a representative of the gods, and his power was granted to him by the deities. This meant that the king was responsible for maintaining the balance of the cosmos, and if he failed to do this, the gods might just replace him. Believe it or not, this was actually something that happened quite frequently. In fact, at one point, the Babylonians even kept two kings in power at once. In 556 BC, Nabopolassar seized the throne and established the Neo-Babylonian Empire. But instead of killing the previous king, Labasha-Marduk, he brought him along as Corrigan. The two kings ruled together until Labasha-Marduk died 8 years later. And when this happened, Nabopolassar took both of his sons to the temple of Marduk and unleashed a plague of locusts upon them. Then he declared the youngest son, Evil Merodach, as the new king. His oldest son had sneezed first, and according to ancient Babylonian beliefs, it was a bad omen if the eldest child sneezed first. Why simple? Apparently, this belief was so widespread that it even had a name. It was called the Law of First Mention. Below these were free commoners who worked as artisans, farmers, fishermen, or laborers. Then there were the slaves, many of whom had been captured in wars. Women of all classes could own property and go to court, but they still relied on male relatives to manage their affairs and rarely had rights equal to men. And if you were a woman of the lower class, your life was even more difficult. You would not only have to do all the housework, but you would also likely be working in the fields as well. Even the best-case scenario for women in Babylonian society was to be married to a nice guy. But as history has shown us time and time again, even that is not always possible. Located in modern-day Iraq, the Babylonian Empire reached its peak between 626 BC and 539 BC. It was during this time that the Babylonians developed some of the most advanced systems of mathematics and astronomy known in the ancient world. They also built one of the largest and most impressive cities in history, with monumental buildings made of baked brick. This was a golden age for the empire, but only for certain people, because in ancient Babylon, nearly everything was decided by signs from the gods. And this meant that every day could be your last. So why was life so terrifying in ancient Babylon? Welcome to my channel. And today, let's find out why life was so terrifying in ancient Babylon. It is important to note that much of what we know about Babylonian society comes from clay tablets that have survived since the empire's collapse.
Ow.
Let us imagine that you are a woman in ancient Babylon who has just been married off to a nice guy. What could go wrong? In the ancient world, kingship was seen as a divine appointment. But there was another ominous event that happened in Babylon, and it involved one of the most traumatic experiences in a baby's life, their first bowel movement. Speaking of bad omens, let's talk about one of the worst things that could happen to you in ancient Babylon, being born with a clubfoot. What's worse, the Babylonians believed that diseases themselves were punishments sent by the gods. But no matter what was ailing you, the first thing you had to do was figure out what god was punishing you. The Babylonians believed that this sort of divine retribution was everywhere. How would you have handled life in ancient Babylon? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. So what do you think?